everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today we are talking about Book Money 101, Advances and Royalties. If this sounds familiar, it's because I did a whole series on money 2 years ago, but boy, if it isn't relevant once again and worth doing a new video. If you're not already familiar, there was a little bit of a hubbub 3 or 4 weeks ago on the Twitters and in YA Author World, when a YA author posted an article on Medium about how they threw away $375,000, something like that. How they wasted it. Really, they spent it. They spent all of this advance money and it was diminishing returns and they had regrets and said, "Nobody told me." I have questions about that. I have doubts because it is definitely possible to educate yourself on how money works in publishing, and you should educate yourself on how money works in publishing because once you get paid for writing books, it is your responsibility to take care of your money and be smart about long-term financial planning. Publishing is a very unstable industry and you shouldn't blow all of your money, and I'm going to talk about how all of that works. The first important thing to know up front is that it is no one's responsibility but your own to manage that money. It's not your agent's job and certainly not your publisher's job to tell you how this all works or what to do. You can ask your agent questions about how it works, obviously, but they aren't there to tell you how to manage your money, whether to quit your job, all of that kind of stuff. Your publisher will pay your agent and then your agency will pay you, but they are not a financial advisor. If you want one, you're going to need to hire one for yourself. I'm just pointing that out because the article in question was like, my agent and publisher didn't tell me. And it's like, well, it's really not their job. You need to know all this stuff, and so I'm here to tell you about all this stuff so that you can't say you didn't know. And as always with these kinds of meaty traditional publishing topics, it's gonna be a long one, folks, but don't worry, I will have timestamps down below so you can jump around. So for starters, traditional publishing relies on the advance system. There are a few smaller publishers that don't pay advances that only do royalties, and we'll talk about royalties in a second. But for the most part in this video, I'm only going to be talking about the advance model since the vast majority of traditional publishers use this model, and this is how you're going to get paid, and this is how you need to think in terms of managing your money. An advance is an advance against sales. It is the amount of money that the publisher thinks your book will earn in royalties. Again, it gets complicated, I'll explain that, not profit, royalties, that they would basically pay to you over a series of years. So they give it to you in advance of publication to pay you for your work. Advances are paid in installments. There are different payment schedules depending on your book deal and what your agent has negotiated with your publisher. But typically, let's say it's one book, there's at least 2 payments on signing of your contract and on delivery of the manuscript. In some cases, there's going to be 3 on signing of contract, on delivery of manuscript, and on publication. And then as you have multi-book deals, the payment schedule will vary. A royalty, of course, is a percentage of every sale that an author is entitled to, but you will not see a cent of royalties until you earn out your advance. Earning out means that your publisher has earned back that full amount based on royalties, not profit. Again, we'll talk about it, that they had paid you in your advance. And I can tell you up front, most authors will never earn out. I've heard an editor toss out the statistic of 80-20. 80% of authors are supported by 20% of authors, meaning 20% are earning out and earning a large profit, and the rest of us don't. So you should not expect to earn out your advance, or if you do, it can take years and years and years. People who earn out quickly are very, very rare. What this means is you should always operate on the assumption that your advance is the only money that you will ever see for your book. Until you have earned out and start seeing royalties, you should account and bank and financial plan based only on that advance and that advance schedule. You have to think about when you're going to be paid as well. Which reminds me, that kind of brings up taxes. Taxes are so complex that I'm going to do an entire separate video on taxes, because this one's already going to tip the scales. It's going to be really, really long, and so I'm going to separate out taxes, so we will talk about that, but they will come up a few times in this video in terms of advances and royalty basics. The good news is, even if you never earn out, you get to keep that advance as long as you met all of your obligations to your publisher, which means turning in your book on time in a satisfactory manner, and they publish it. There are cases where you do have to return your advance. I go over this in my contracts video. It's basically if everything goes horribly and you're not turning in manuscripts, etc., so on and so forth. Okay, so let's dig into advances. How do publishers determine advances? This is important for understanding the publishing industry and the long-term kind of financial health situation you might find yourself in, because understanding how your advance was arrived at will give you a better sense of what may or may not happen to you over time. So the Medium article in question, the author got 2 very high advances for her first 2 book deals and then did not even come close to earning out, had really low sales figures, and so all subsequent advances, she was very lucky to continue selling books, but all of those subsequent advances were much, much lower. This is what happens if you don't meet sales targets on those higher advances. You should never expect to continue receiving 6-figure advances throughout your career. This just is a unicorn scenario for most authors. I mean, to get a 6-figure deal in the first place. They're far more rare now than they were back when this author sold. So how does the publisher determine an advance? I've talked about this in my submission video, but when your book goes to the acquisitions meeting, the sales team and your editor will do a profit and loss statement. This is a sales projection of, well, how much do they think your book will sell versus loss? And they do all these complex calculations to figure out their profit, not profit to you, not your royalty. Publishing's really complicated, but how much they expect to make off your book, and then they determine whether it's worth it to them. Whether it's worth it to them to buy it, and then if they are going to buy it, how much advance to pay you. Your publisher will weigh factors such as the market, how similar books are doing, comp titles, how similar books have done on their list, and again, what they think you would earn in royalties. So it's this complex calculation of their profit. Your royalties, standard royalties, by the way, are only about 10%. So if a book costs $17, you're only getting $1.70 per copy. Earning out, this is why earning out is so difficult, because you get such a small slice of the pie. It is worth it, by the way, in traditional publishing, because they do a ton of other stuff, but just FYI. This is why the advance system is nice, because they are paying you up front and you don't have to wait years and years and years to get royalty checks. I will mention that there are a few other factors that do come into consideration when it comes to setting an advance for a book. The clout of the agent does matter. The clout of the author, obviously, if you're already established. If you are selling subsequent books, if it's not your debut, they're gonna look at the sales of your previous books to determine your advance. So important is whether you're selling in a preempt or an auction. A preempt meaning they want to give you more money so that you will pull it from other publishers so it doesn't go to an auction, which is when multiple houses compete. Anytime you have that kind of market competition, it will drive up the amount of the advance. Generally, publishers really hedge on the advance. I've seen them really lowball people, and it is a good agent's job to know when they're doing that and get them to negotiate up. And when you have a really good agent, they don't lowball them in the first place. So these are just important things to know about kind of how that advance works. It really varies on what you're writing, the kind of book you're writing, and the market, and your agent, and how much they think it's gonna sell. So I already talked about the payment schedule for your advance, and I just want to offer you a sample of my payment schedule for my 2-book deal, which was divided into 3 payments per book on signing of contract. So I basically got a massive chunk of the money because it was on signing of both of them, on delivery of each manuscript, and on publication of each manuscript. And something to bear in mind in terms of the timing is you'll be given an ideal publication schedule when you first get your book deal, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes you need to delay your book. I needed an extension, and that extension ended up meaning my book publication got pushed almost an entire year, which means I don't get a book payment for the whole of 2019. The next time I'm going to get one is 2020. I still have my day job, so I haven't been banking on any of these book payments to pay bills. But imagine if I had, and I had come into this situation of, I'm not going to get a single payment for an entire year. This is not that uncommon, so always bear in mind that publishing schedules are complicated and they can change. Sometimes it's not on your end. Things that can bump your payment schedule include your editor leaving. If they have to hire a new editor, they might bump your publication by 6 months to a year or more, which changes when you're going to get paid. They could want you to do more developmental edits. It's not your choice to do more edits, it's theirs, and again, you get bumped. The longer it takes to turn in an acceptable manuscript, the longer it takes to get paid for that acceptable manuscript and then get paid for publication, if that is how your schedule is set up. I just say this to give you a complete picture of all of the weird dynamics that can come into play with how advances are paid out. Royalty statements, on the other hand, you will see these approximately every 6 months. Different publishers operate on different kind of 2-quarter systems, but generally it's every 6 months. But everyone in publishing is always behind. I'm always shocked when I hear about a publisher sending out a royalty statement on time, and it may end up like you'll get a royalty statement 8 months after maybe you should have. Everything is always slow, and your agent is there to push them to get those statements, because those statements are going to tell you, well, how many copies you've sold, how many copies have been returned, and how much you have earned towards your advance. So to that end, let's talk a little bit more about earning out, important things that you need to know. Joint versus separate accounting. So most publishers are going to try to get joint accounting, and most agents are going to fight for separate accounting. Sometimes the publisher just wins. If you want the deal, you got to go with joint, and sometimes the agent wins. And where separate accounting benefits an author is if the 2 books in your deal or multiple books in your deal are accounted separately, you have a shot at earning out on a single book versus an entire series of books or book series. So for example, let's say you got a 2-book deal, $25,000 per book, a total book deal of $50,000, and you are separately accounted. It means that you only have to earn out $25,000 on each book. And I know you're going, what is the difference? Here is the difference. Let's say book 1 in your series sells very, very well, and you earn $30,000 on that book in a year. You would get a royalty payment of $5,000 after that first book had earned out if you are separately accounted. Let's say that the second book tanks, really tanks, and you only sell $10,000. If you're separately accounted, it just means you'll get royalties on book number 1 and not on book number 2. If you're joint accounted, this is where it benefits the publisher. Put those 2 scenarios together. Joint accounted, you've sold $40,000 rather than the $50,000 that we're earning out, so you are not considered earned out, and you won't be until either book 1 or book 2 cumulatively sells more copies. But what if your book series just falls off the map completely and you just never earn out? Happens all the time. And generally speaking, book 1 in a series will always outsell all the other books in a series. So having that one in particular separately accounted can really benefit an author. But again, publishers will always fight for joint accounting, and sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. But bear that in mind. It can make a huge difference for ever seeing royalties on a title. Okay, so I talked about profit versus royalty, and this is where it becomes important to you as an author, understanding what earning out means and doesn't mean, and how it looks for your career. So most authors don't earn out, so it's normal not to, and you shouldn't feel bad if you don't, and you should also not expect to earn out. I talked about profit versus royalties, so you only earn out if you earn back what they would pay you in royalties, which is only like 10% of the book, depending on the format. Trade paperback standard is like 7.5%, and ebook standards vary. Here's the thing. The publisher sees a profit to them. They make money off of you and your book long before you ever earn out. which means you don't have to come close to earning out to being a success for the publisher. Earning out doesn't equal success. I mean, earning out does equal success, but not earning out doesn't equal failure. It's very relative to your advance and exactly how many copies that has moved and how much money your publisher has made off of them. So there's a difference between selling only 500 copies, and yeah, your publisher's never going to see profit on that relative to what they paid you, and selling 10,000 copies, which you also won't earn out on, but that's a decent amount of copies, and as long as your advance wasn't sky high, like one of those crazy high six-figure ones, your publisher will make a profit on selling that number of books. What this means is you can definitely get subsequent book deals even if you haven't earned out. It doesn't mean they're going to be at the same advance range, though they might be. It might mean your advance goes down, but it does mean your career doesn't die just because you don't earn out. I know that is a huge worry that authors have, so I wanted to point that out. So just to kind of summarize advances, don't forget, they're paid in installments, they can be delayed, you'll probably never earn out, you have to give 15% to your agent, and you have to pay taxes on them. I'll give you the short version, which is save 40% of your advance for taxes. We'll do a whole video on taxes. So your advance is always smaller than you think it is, of like the actual money that you're gonna get, and you're going to get it over a much longer period of time than you think you will. And there are no guarantees in the publishing industry, so never bank on, I'm gonna quit my job because I'm just gonna get $100,000 advances all the time. No, you might not. So I wanted to go over what you should do with your advance. This was actually a conversation that came out of that Medium article. Everyone was like, well, what do you do? Well, I'll tell you what you really probably shouldn't do, which is quit your job and move to one of the most expensive cities in the world. But here's my advice on what you should do with your advance. Save 40% for taxes, as already mentioned. Treat yourself a little bit. Always find or treat yourself. Just how much you treat yourself is gonna range based on how much that advance is. 3, set aside like 10% for marketing. You always want to have that fallback in case your publisher doesn't do anything for you, which does happen sometimes. Hire an accountant. It's really important. So taxes become way more complicated when you get a book deal, and an accountant can help you save money and also help you figure out where to invest it. Even though they're not a financial advisor, it was my tax accountant who suggested I put some of my advance into a retirement account so I could save on my taxes. And my 5th suggestion is to put some of this money into a retirement account. Not only because you're gonna save on your taxes, but because a lot of writers don't save for retirement, and that's a bad financial planning decision. You should always be socking away money for retirement, even though it's really, really hard to do in this economy. But especially if you are keeping a day job or you have a spouse with a day job, you should be taking that book money and banking it as much as possible. Really, most of my advice is don't spend most of your advance because you just don't know what's going to happen with your publishing career. So yeah, save the rest. Now, if you have a really small advance, because they do range, you can do all of this if you have a higher 5-figure or a 6-figure advance. You definitely are more limited if you get a smaller advance. I always recommend treating yourself, and I always recommend saving. So you might have to skimp a little bit on the retirement savings or the marketing budget, but yeah. Which we should talk about living off your advance, and the truth is most people simply can't. A huge part of that is the payment schedule. It is so sporadic. Publishers are notoriously late with payments. Mine is actually almost always on time, but I hear that's not entirely normal. But again, you can have things delayed because of things out of your control, like editors leaving, publishing schedules changing. So relying on advance income to live off of is pretty dangerous. I always recommend when you get a book deal, having a nice little spreadsheet, and you know I created one for you. It was linked in my videos 2 years ago, so I'm gonna link to it down below again. It's a spreadsheet with all the formulas plugged in. You plug in your advance and you have the different payment schedules. You have to adjust it, but it'll tell you the taxes and it'll tell you how much goes to your agent and then how much you end up with at the end. So I suggest you do this calculation, plugging in your expected payment schedule, especially the years, so you actually know what your take-home income from books is going to be year to year. If you are single, unless you get a massive, massive book deal, you probably simply cannot quit your job. I mean, even if you do, where are you gonna get health insurance? That's the thing. Never forget about health insurance. Book money is book money, but it's not the same as working for a company. You are an independent contractor, so you'd have to go out on the free market and pay for health insurance if you are American. If you're not American, you might be in a much better situation. So you always need to take that into consideration. And if you have a partner, have a very frank, honest financial discussion with them if and when you get a book deal, or if it's you're several contracts in and you're thinking you might want to quit your day job. It is possible over a longer period of time with some financial planning, but you want to have that conversation, have that chart ready, and really think about income and have a contingency plan. It's also totally okay to change your day job. I know people who have dropped from full-time and gotten a part-time job, changed industry so that it's more conducive to writing. There are definitely options that you can do to essentially work around book advances and what you're being paid and how and when. Okay, royalties. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because most of you will simply never see them. Me too. So, royalties. Though if you're with, again, a smaller publisher that either does really small advances or no advances at all, royalties are actually going to matter to you. But royalties, it's a percentage of every sale on your book that goes towards you, the author. As I already mentioned, royalties are relatively small, but it's because your traditional publisher puts up all of the money up front to do all of the work on your book and get it out there and get it sold. So some standard royalty rates for you to know: 10% on hardcover, usually up to a certain amount of copies. That is going to vary depending on the advance that they are paying you, and your agent can negotiate within reason the hardcover percentage or sometimes just the amount of copies, because then often once you hit that benchmark of copies, the royalty rate will go up to, say, 12.5%. It varies contract to contract, but mine was definitely negotiated. It was 10% up to a certain amount of copies, and my agent negotiated the number of copies down, and then it goes to 12.5% on hardcover. Standard for paperback, I've seen anything between 6 and 8% on deals where the hardcover was first and it was a pretty reasonable advance. Again, if you're with a smaller publisher or a publisher that pays much smaller advances, often your agent can negotiate these rates up because you're getting less of an advance, so they can get those royalty rates negotiated up. But these are kind of standard on standard traditional publishing deals with slightly higher advances and thus higher benchmarks for amount of copies sold and these standard royalty rates. I've seen 25% as the standard for electronic sales, so digital copies. I've seen higher in some places, but I asked a few people. I check my own contracts, then ask other people. 25% seems to be pretty standard on ebook. But of course, remember, you get less if your publisher discounts it, which often is the only way to sell ebooks. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So the fact of royalties is earning royalties tends to be the best way to have a steady writing career. I mean, not always, but theoretically, if you've earned out your advance and you start earning royalties, you are steadily selling copies, and so you'll get payments every 6 months. They will vary widely how much is on that royalty statement, but the more books you write and the more books that earn out, your royalties, of course, are going to accumulate. And front list sells backlist, so writing is really a long game, and earning money off of books is a long game. And then, this is almost a topic for another video. I have so many feelings about how hard it actually is for newer writers to establish that long career. It's way harder than it used to be, so how are you ever going to get to the point of earning out any book and earning royalties and trying to establish a financially stable career? I don't know. In the meantime, just assume you're not going to earn out and you're never going to see royalties and save your money. I can also tell you just some fun facts. You can be a New York Times bestseller and not earn out and thus never see royalties. You can have one breakout book and earn out on one book and never earn out on the others. So it just varies really, really widely. I feel like I'm scaring a ton of you out of traditional publishing, but I must remind you that a slice of a pie that people are eating is better than a slice of nothing. So don't forget that traditional publishing for certain titles and certain authors is still your best opportunity at ever selling any copies of your book and getting them into anyone's hands. But this is again why the advance system is actually in your favor, because let's say the publisher really screws up and they vastly overestimate how much will sell, or the market changes and it's totally not your fault. You get to keep the money, so yay. And honestly, if they vastly underestimate how much you're going to sell, then you'll sell gangbusters and start earning really good royalties. So, pros and cons. I'm going to close with just some takeaways on advances, key things to know. Kind of a summary wrap-up, but a few of these are new. The first thing to know is very often the size of your advance determines how much marketing support you are going to get in-house. Not always, because sometimes the marketing team or the sales force really falls in love with the title that maybe got a smaller advance at acquisitions, and they push it really hard and it blows up. But far more often, the higher the advance, the more they think it will sell, and so they put more resources behind selling it. It does sometimes happen that someone who got a mega huge advance doesn't really get any marketing support. It's rare, but it does happen, which is why I warn my unicorn friends who might be watching this, or they might not. They might be sipping champagne on a terrace somewhere, unwisely. You can totally get a $500,000 book deal, a 7-figure book deal, and then your publisher does almost no marketing for you. I have seen this more than once, which is like kind of mind-blowing, but very often it's the market changing and them going, oh shoot, it doesn't make sense to push this as our lead title, and then you get paid $500,000 and you sell 1,000 copies and your career's probably over. Honestly, not always, but often. Publishing is interesting, but I also have heard of really great stories where they paid a $10,000 advance and the book really picked up steam and the author earned out in like 3 weeks and now makes tons of money. By the way, when you are in that situation where you get a lower advance on a book and then you sell gangbusters, you get to get a much higher advance for your next book. That's the next takeaway for you. It's always changing and shifting kind of how much you are worth as an author. It's pretty depressing, I won't lie. Once you have a sales history, that sales history is going to follow you forever. And by the way, that's why it can be tricky, not impossible, for self-published authors to transition into traditional publishing. Your self-published sales will follow you in traditional publishing. That said, if you have great sales in self-publishing, that can be a real boon to you in traditional publishing. So that is how it works, though. I have a sales history now, so all subsequent books I sell, they're going to look at that sales history. Now, things can change. I have a sales history in one genre. I'm writing in another genre. Who knows? But once you're no longer entry level, the whole way that advances work, it can vary widely. They can go up, they can go down. They're more likely to go down than up. And so, I'm sorry to keep referring to the Medium article, but this was a thing where the author just never predicted that her advances would go down, and I'm like, prepare for this. If you were lucky enough to sell more books, sometimes your advances go down if you aren't bringing in the sales numbers. Another thing I want to warn you of, generally advances, at least certainly in YA, are going down, not up. The era of everyone gets a 6-figure book deal is more or less over. Outliers will get massive 6-figure book deals, and the rest of us will get modest, hopefully not slap in the face advances, mid to high 5 figures. Low to mid 5 figures is a pretty good spot to be. Low 5 figures is depressing, and hopefully you have a good enough agent to negotiate higher than that. But some genres really just don't warrant higher advances. They are more of a risk for a publisher. If the lifetime of a title is only going to sell 3,000 or 4,000 copies, and that's a good number for that title, it just doesn't make sense to pay that person $50,000. It's tough, especially thinking that different books are worth different things, because we all put in blood, sweat, and tears, and we're all worth more than that in that sense. But the reality of the free market and how publishing works is that we're not paid a salary, an equal and even salary for writing books. We're paid on spec. We're paid per book depending on the market and what the publisher feels it is worth, what the publisher thinks it is going to sell. And that is just kind of the system that we are part of. I also want to let you know that advances are lower in adult than they are in YA. YA really inflated the idea of what an advance was, because for a while there we really were handing out 6-figure deals like candy, and there's some massive deals, and you only hear about the massive deals in the press, by the way. You don't hear about everyone else's deals. And it has created this idea that I can become a millionaire if I write YA. I mean, maybe, but probably not. And if you write adults, you should just set your expectations lower. It's very rare to get a six-figure deal, especially as a debut in adult, because it's a more mature book market and they're a little bit smarter about hedging on sales. Though with YA saturating, to my previous point, this is why advances are going down and things are starting to kind of even out. This means, of course, that fewer and fewer people can write full-time. That is just the reality. The odds of you being able to eke out a career, money that supports yourself in writing is less likely. If you are partnered with someone who has a steady income and health insurance and benefits, you are in a much better position than not partnered people or people who don't have trust funds. I have a video on not quitting your day job. I'll link to it down below, and I'll probably make a brand new one because it's an evergreen topic. Everyone is in a very different position personally and financially. All you can do is know as much information going in as possible and use that information to make smart choices. I mentioned an accountant, but I didn't mention a financial advisor. This is optional, but you might want to get one or at least have a consultation with one if you're getting into this. They can take an honest look at your finances and let you know what they think, though you are probably going to have to explain to them how book money works because the average financial advisor just doesn't understand how unsteady book money is. I have a financial advisor now and I had to explain it to him because it's weird. Publishing money is very, very weird. But honestly, I think the smartest thing any of us can do is save as much as possible and never bank on it continuing as is or earning out. More often than not, unless you're a huge breakout and hugely successful, publishing is diminishing returns. So this is where I will leave you. This is a big topic, so drop any of your questions down below. I will answer as many of them as possible, as well as I am able to. And you're gonna get more videos on money. There's more to talk about in this topic, but I thought advances in Royalties 101 would be really helpful to you. So give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I'll make more, because if I'm not here to give you facts and severely depress you, what am I doing? If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post 2 to 3 videos a week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, guys, happy writing and happy financial planning. Be smart with your money, please. This industry it's tough.